In a previous video, I discussed how Ben Wheatley's Sightseers utilises a set of disappointed spatial expectations to generate its tensions, and it was always my intention to bring in a comparison with Mike Leigh's Nuts in May. Filmed for BBC's Play for Today and broadcast in 1976, Nuts in May would seem to serve as a blueprint for sightseers in significant ways. A lopsided relationship in which an overbearing male dominates and infantilizes his partner, a desire to find tranquility within the rural that is subverted by the presence of other annoying people. Whilst Wheatley himself claims to have been unaware of the play until after he'd finished his own film, Sightseers' principal actors and writers, Alice Lowe and Steve Oram, have expressed a love of Nuts in May, and it's therefore clear to see why the two dovetail so beautifully. In fact, I'd add With Nail and Die into the mix and suggest the three films represent a triptych of terrible trips or horrible holidays. Cheap alliteration is hard to resist. Nuts in May concerns a couple leaving the city for a camping holiday in Dorset, where they intend to exchange the noise and pace of the urban for the languid and pastoral vistas of the rural. The appropriately named Keith Pratt is tediously pedantic and probably suffering from an obsessive compulsion disorder that manifests itself in his following rules that absolutely must not be deviated from. His wife, Candice Marie, is childlike and almost entirely capitulates to Keith's whims. Whilst there seems to be a very functional dynamic at work in their relationship, it's one in which Keith behaves parentally, and Candice Marie is essentially infantilized. There are other fundamental identity differences at work within their relationship, and these are evidenced during a visit to Corfe Castle, where Keith is momentarily taken aback by the views from the summit the castle is seated upon, before he quickly turns to his itinerary, reading off the items contained in the tourist guide. Edward Ralph suggests that an inauthentic attitude to place is nowhere more clearly expressed than in tourism. For in tourism, individual and authentic judgment about places is nearly always subsumed to expert or socially accepted opinion, or the act and means of tourism become more important than the places visited. Keith barely takes in the experience of being at the castle, instead preferring to simply spot numbered areas of interest within the brochure. At one point, Candice Marie asks him about a specific feature of the castle, and he replies, "That's number 4. The feature's mediated status within the authoritative guide takes precedence over its visual and historical identity. For Keith, merely visiting the castle is enough. He seemingly takes no interest in engaging with the space, and certainly makes no authentic judgment. However, Candice Marie's attitude towards the castle and new spaces in general is entirely different. She imagines how the castle must have looked in its heyday, extemporaneously suggesting to Keith that it must have been filled with kings and queens walking about in all their fineries. Not only is Candice Marie fully present in the space she's visiting, she's able to appreciate and visualize the castle's history. Essentially, she's authentically engaging with this space in terms that Ralph describes as a direct and genuine experience of the entire complex of the identity of places. Whilst there is some minimal but manageable tension that results from Keith's behavioural rigidity when set against Candice Marie's comparatively flexible attitude towards their schedule, it's only when the couple encounter other campers at the site that more severe tensions are generated. The first of these campers is Ray, a trainee PE teacher, spending some time alone with his tent and radio, the latter of which immediately sets him at odds with Keith. As is the case in all of the situations where tension is generated, Candice Marie is a constantly haranguing presence, urging Keith to act and effectively preventing him from adopting a passive stance. This dynamic is perhaps understandable given the dominant parental role Keith enjoys in most other situations. It's natural then that Candice Marie expects Keith to intervene in situations where she's disturbed by the behaviour of others. This is the case with Ray and his radio. After some prodding from his wife, Keith approaches Ray and informs him that we've come down here to get away from the hurly-burly of town life. We've come to be in the peace of the countryside, and your radio is rather disturbing that peace. The tensions present when living within close proximity to other people is, at least in Keith's view, not to be expected in the countryside, where it's assumed that the increased personal space will foster greater privacy. Keith's initial response of trying to ignore the radio is precisely what people do in the city, where, as Fran Tonkin states, there is an accepted contradiction between the collective nature of social life and the radical solitude of the individual, between the claims of the group and that of the person. Within the urban locale, we might well be deeply irritated by the noises made by other people, yet we are painfully aware that proximity is unavoidably reduced. Keith's reasoning that the countryside is an intrinsically tranquil space is, however, idealistic. He's attempting to enforce his own ideas concerning peaceful relaxation onto Ray, who, it seems, finds listening to his radio while camping to be perfectly soothing. Indeed, while Keith bemoans the intrusion of pop music into the space of the campsite, he and Candice Marie find it perfectly acceptable to play through their repertoire of whimsical songs for banjo and guitar. A little later, after Candice Marie is warmed to Ray, she and Keith treat him to one of these tunes. This is a bizarre performance during which Keith's pedantry sees him explaining the structure of the song's lines during the actual performance. This is the one creative endeavour that Keith partakes in, and even this is subject to his patronising over-analysis. Throughout Nuts in May, Keith demonstrates an inability to view his own beliefs and rituals as anything other than subjective choices. Whilst he and Candice Marie talk to Ray, they ask him if he eats meat, to which Ray replies that he loves it. Rather than accept this as a choice made by another adult, Keith proceeds to extol the virtues of vegetarianism, citing famous vegetarians as evidence of the dietary practice's allure, even quoting a passage from the book of Genesis that seemingly advocates a plant-based diet. This example perfectly illustrates the extremes of Keith's mania. Whilst it's possible to sympathise with his desire for tranquility during his stay at the site, and his remonstrations to that effect can be viewed as just, this sermon on his own dietary choices is apropos of nothing and clearly irks Ray. The fact that he cites Malcolm Muggeridge as a noteworthy vegetarian and chooses a quote from the Bible as evidence of his diet's virtues suggests a morality that is tempered by religious doctrine and therefore essentially subjective. During this and other encounters with Ray, Keith barely conceals his contempt towards the man. This is partly due to the fact that Ray's lifestyle is seemingly at odds with Keith's own, but partly because his wife seems to demonstrate genuine warmth towards Ray. Whilst Candice Marie shares Keith's beliefs, dietary and otherwise, her own exchanges with Ray are devoid of Keith's vitriol and self-righteousness. The relative friendliness of these exchanges does not escape Keith's attention, and he becomes increasingly irritated by Candice Marie mentioning Ray, culminating in a scene where she asks Keith his opinion about Ray studying geology alongside his PE module. And Keith angrily says, "Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?" before marching over to Ray's tent and somewhat angrily stating his wife's question, much to the chagrin of Ray and Candice Marie. This petulant behaviour somewhat subverts Keith's parental role within his relationship, demonstrating as it does a tendency towards childish tantrums on his part. However, it is possible to view his anger as sexual jealousy. It is difficult to view Keith as a sexual being, and one can only imagine the pedantry he might demonstrate during coitus, perhaps describing each stage of the act as it occurs. Indeed, the parental, or at best platonic, nature of Keith's attitude towards his wife is demonstrated in two scenes within their tent. In both instances, as Keith is about to turn off their lamp before they sleep, in separate sleeping bags of course, he kisses Candice Marie perfunctorily on the lips. In the first scene, she asks Keith to kiss Prudence, a plush cat that she sleeps with that reinforces her childlike demeanour, and Keith does so. In the second scene, when Candice Marie asks that Keith kiss Prudence, he says he's too tired. Clearly then, Prudence is a symbolic sexual conduit that stands in for the act of coitus. When Keith refuses to kiss the toy, he's denying Candice Marie the symbolic sexual act out of petulance. Given their lack of physical intimacy, it's possible to view Keith's jealousy towards Ray and his irritation at the warm language Candice Marie uses when talking about him as an admission of his own lack of sexual desire, or perhaps inability to partake in intercourse. Tensions on the site increase dramatically with the arrival of another couple. Finger and Honky are a younger couple and arrive on a motorbike wearing clothes that suggest they are flamboyant and fashionable, or at least in the year 1976. They seem rooted in the temporal moment where Keith and Candice Marie are oddly archaic and idiosyncratic. They immediately make lots of noise, talking in loud voices that irritate both Candice Marie and Keith. The new couple quickly befriend Ray, who takes them to the pub that evening. When they return, they make plentiful noise, singing and engaging in drunken tomfoolery. Finger and Honky retire to their tent where they continue to shriek with laughter and engage in some sexual teasing, which again sets them in contrast to the platonic and non-physical nature of Keith and Candice Marie's bedtime routine. Again, urged on by his wife's haranguing, Keith approaches their tent and tells them that he can hear every word they say and that they're disturbing him. As Keith walks back to his own tent, Finger shouts, "Get back to your bed," to which Keith angrily replies, "And you get back to your tenements." This last statement reveals another of Keith's prejudices. Given the term tenement refers to multi-occupation buildings traditionally used to house working class tenants and associated with heavily populated urban areas. Finger and Honky both have West Midlands accents, and Ray later confirms this by asking Finger if he supports Birmingham City or Villa. Clearly, Keith has conflated Finger and Honky's antisocial behaviour with being working class and demonises them as figures of the sort of behaviours redolent of the urban that he's retreated to the rural to avoid. It's significant that Keith's anger is directed towards the couple as urban residents. His other exchanges with working class people never contain this same bile. For instance, he speaks at length to both a farmer and a stonemason, both of whom perform roles and speak in heavy regional accents that mark them as being essentially working class. Keith's outburst, then, is an outpouring of something deeply seated within his psyche. This anger, which is otherwise effectively contained, is loosed fully when Finger decides to make a fire. Keith points out that doing so is forbidden according to both the rules governing the campsite and the countryside code. Ignoring Keith's advice, Finger continues to snap branches off nearby trees and tells Keith to mind his own business. The situation comes to a head when Keith threatens to make a citizen's arrest and hints at using force if necessary, a threat that Finger refutes. In response to what he views as a challenge to his authority, Keith picks up a large stick and threatens Finger, challenging him to fight and threatening to knock his block off. This is indeed a surreal moment that demonstrates Keith's inability to cope with a situation where his belief system cannot be enforced upon another person. Whilst Finger's actions are arrogant and dangerous, it's his refusal to capitulate to Keith's authority, or his invoking of both the authority of the site's rules and the countryside code, that inspires the violent confrontation. And there's a great irony in the fact that had Keith encountered this behaviour within the urban that he's retreated from, there would be systems of authority in place that he could have called upon to intervene. As it is, he cannot locate the site's owner and instead finds he cannot simply ignore Finger's rebellious acts and instead enters into a violent psychological meltdown, one that leaves him reeling and in tears. Clearly then, Nuts preempts the themes that generate tension within Wheatley's film, even if Sightseers takes Keith's repressed anger to murderous extremes. In both films, the countryside is invested with impossibly utopian qualities that can only ever be disappointing. Given the presence of other people with other opinions and ideas about which behaviours are and are not acceptable. Whilst Keith is indeed a prat of the highest order, his desire to escape the alienated urban landscape is not entirely unrelatable.